Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. We are going to get started in just a moment. We're just going to give folks a minute to join the webinar. Okay, I think we'll hop in. Good evening, everyone, or I should say dive into Tuition Exchange. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. I am Liz Ryle Lewinsky, Associate Vice President here at the Tuition Exchange, and am joined by our President, Dr. Kristen Tishner, who will
Hello,
be
everyone. We're glad you could join us this evening, and we're excited about you kicking off your tuition exchange scholarship search.
Thanks, Kristen. So we are going to dive right into TE. But before we do, just a few housekeeping items. There will be a QR code on the final slide, so you can capture a copy of the presentation this evening. We will also hold this webinar again in July. Do you have any friends who couldn't join us or you want to come again? You're welcome to register again. But as we get to the end of July, and are past that July 16th webinar, we will post a recording of one of the webinars to the tuitionexchange.org website, to the family webinar page. But we are thrilled to have you here this evening. I'll also mention, I know as a parent of college student that you probably come to the webinar with specific questions. And if you find that as we get to the end of the presentation that we haven't answered your questions, you can feel free at that point to post them via the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, and Kristen and I will be taking questions. So we are going to hop right in, and that water looks nice and cool for those of you in the middle of a heat wave. Glad you're hopefully inside staying cool with us this evening and putting your time to good use. So at the Tuition Exchange, as our slide shows here, we are really here to support our member institutions and their faculty and staff and their dependents. And really our mission is to make education more affordable for students who participate in the program. As you can see, we have a fair number of students. This is just the 24-25 year data. So we have a significant number of students receiving tuition exchange scholarships at our member schools, which today tally 713 schools. And while we are exchanging students in the program, not dollars, the scholarships awarded totaled a little over $328 million for this past year. So the program has such a great impact. So thank you to all that you do to support your students and your colleagues in the program and for the work that you do. Kristen and I say will be your dive masters this evening. Both of us have had children in college. Kristen's thankfully have gone on to become gainfully employed. I have two currently in college, and both of us spent over 3 decades at the college university level in the enrollment management field until actually a year ago when we joined Tuition Exchange, a little over a year ago for Kristen. So we have been where you are in your seat, and we hope to be able to share knowledge of the process with you this evening. So we're going to cover quite a bit. We're going to really start from the basics of tuition exchange, get you familiar with some of the common terms that you'll hear as you go through the process, and then really dive right in as to how your student can apply for tuition exchange, what types of questions you're likely going to have, and questions you might want to pose to others as you and your students go through the process. And really excited that this past year we solicited parents of current tuition exchange recipients to ask for their tips. So while Kristen and I will have our own to share with you as parents, we wanted to gather tips from the masses, and we're going to share some of the tips from parents of current tuition exchange recipients with you this evening. And then we'll also have time, as mentioned, for questions that we haven't covered when we get to the close of our presentation. You'll see a little set of eyes on some slides. That's a reminder to me as we run through to hop into the website and show you where you can find certain things, because I would guess most of you are just starting this process or getting ready to start this process for the first time. So what is tuition exchange? Basically, how did we come about? We're really excited to have just celebrated our 70th anniversary this past year. And we were started actually by faculty and staff up in New England in 1954. A small group of colleges got together because they found that, not surprisingly, that their children didn't necessarily want to go to the colleges or universities that they were employed at. And in fact, one of the inaugural schools in the program was an all-male institution at the time. And so they wanted to have options for their daughters as well. So the program started small and then grew and grew over the years. And as I said, today we have 713 member institutions throughout the country in 50 states and territories, and also in 9 international countries. So we really do believe that there is a school choice for all. And we're going to talk about the scholarship itself, but basically for schools that are member institutions, they have the option to offer a tuition exchange scholarship that is full tuition, or what we call the TE set rate amount. And we're going to talk in a little more detail about that in a second. But as I mentioned when we kicked off tonight's webinar, it is a reciprocal scholarship program where students have the opportunity to attend and potentially receive tuition exchange scholarships at other tuition exchange member schools. So it's an exchange of students, if you will, not of actual dollars. There's a lot of flexibility for member institutions that are in the program, and they really have the ability to determine who is eligible in terms of faculty and staff dependents at their school, and what those criteria are for eligibility. And on the flip side, they are able to be flexible in determining who they offer tuition exchange scholarships to. So there could be certain strategic priorities that the institution has in terms of enrollment. And so maybe when they're awarding tuition exchange scholarships, they will award students that will help further those strategic priorities. So all to say, schools have flexibility to administer the program under their own guidelines, and that goes for the guidelines that they put forth in terms of offering students tuition exchange scholarships. So the scholarships aren't guaranteed. I think that's important if you're starting off in the process to recognize that. And just like the admissions process can be very competitive depending upon the institution, receiving a tuition exchange scholarship can be more competitive at certain schools versus other institutions. And we're going to talk a little bit more about some strategies as your students go through the process. Keep in mind that your school might have forms that you need to fill out. And similarly, the schools that your students are applying for tuition exchange scholarships to might have their own separate forms that they require. Some schools, for example, require the FAFSA, the free application for federal student aid. Some might require the CSS profile form. And there are some schools that charge fees to individuals, either the faculty and staff that are utilizing the program at their institution, or in some cases, if a student is awarded a tuition exchange scholarship, there might be a fee passed on to the family. And we'll talk about how you can find out if a school charges any fees for the tuition exchange program. We touched a little bit on the amount of the scholarship, but I want to delve into some of the terms that you're going to come across as you go through this process. So Kristen and I are a part of what's called TE Central. There are 4 of us total, And we are the employees that support the tuition exchange member schools that administer the program on your campuses. Those individuals that administer the program at your institution, they're called a TLO, or a tuition exchange liaison officer. And they will be your primary contact as your students go through the process. We at TE Central, we support the TLOs. And when we talk about the application process, you're going to hear the term export and import used a lot, and you'll see it throughout our website at tuitionexchange.org as well. So I'll use an example because I think it will probably help to illustrate. Let's say we have Chris Clark. He's an employee at Potter University. Chris has a daughter, we'll call her Cassie Clark, and she is eligible to apply for tuition exchange according to Potter University's tuition exchange policy. And keep in mind that policy can vary depending upon the school. Usually you can find the tuition exchange policy and who was eligible for tuition exchange wherever any tuition benefit information is housed on your campus. That might be like your faculty staff handbook, maybe a faculty staff portal, and maybe even on your public website. But certainly human resources would be able to tell you who is eligible for tuition exchange at your institution. So in this case, Cassie, Chris's daughter, remember Chris is the employee, she's considered an export of Potter University. She's going to be applying for tuition exchange at other colleges and universities within the network. Let's say Cassie applies for tuition exchange at 15 different colleges and universities that she's applying for admission to as well. And one of those schools, Griffin College, offers her a tuition exchange scholarship. She decides to go to Griffin College and take advantage of that tuition exchange scholarship, and she would be considered an import of Griffin College. So she'll be coming into Griffin College from the export school, Potter University. So we talked a little bit about the scholarship amount, but member schools in the network have the option to offer a full tuition scholarship, or they can offer a scholarship that is in the amount of what we call the TE set rate amount. And that's a flat amount that is predetermined annually by the Tuition Exchange Board of Directors. So just for example, for the current upcoming 25-26 academic year, that TE set rate amount is $43,000. For the 26-27 academic year, that TE set rate amount is $44,000. So it could be that a school chooses to offer a tuition exchange scholarship that is somewhere between the TE set rate amount and their tuition, if their tuition's higher than the set rate amount. And I'll also mention, you'll see a little asterisk there, if the institution is a public institution, they would offer to an in-state student a full tuition scholarship, but they have to offer to an out-of-state student a minimum tuition exchange scholarship that would be the equivalent of 50% of their out-of-state tuition rate. You're also going to see another term throughout the website that says FACHEX, and that is actually a Jesuit institution exchange. So there are 26 Catholic Jesuit institutions that participate in the FACHEX program. And if you are an employee at one of those institutions, when your student applies for tuition exchange to a school that is one of the FACHEX participating schools, they will be considered for tuition exchange or FACHEX. It'll be up to the school to designate what type of scholarship they're receiving. FACHEX scholarships are full tuition scholarships, but just again to clarify, your student would only get consideration for a FACHEX scholarship if you are an employee at one of the FACHEX program participating institutions. So as you think about the application process, and we'll talk in a few minutes about the timeline itself, if your student or you are a rising high school senior, you're getting ready to launch, right? You're getting ready to dive in, and that application process for tuition exchange really goes hand in hand with the admissions process. So schools will not offer a tuition exchange scholarship to a student who has not applied for admission and has not been accepted. So if your student is going to be applying for tuition exchange, you want to make sure that they also plan to apply for admission to the schools that they are selecting on the tuition exchange application. So we'll talk in a little more detail in a second about that search process and some tools that we have to help you and your student through the search process. But one of the common questions we always get is, well, do I have to apply for admissions first and then apply for tuition exchange? Does it matter? It doesn't really matter. You can do it at the same time. You know, your student can apply for admission and take care of that piece, and they can also apply for tuition exchange at the same time. It doesn't really matter about the order, but the important thing is, again, they really don't want to list a school on their tuition exchange application that they don't plan to apply for admission to, because schools will only offer a tuition exchange scholarship to a student that is admitted to their institution. But just being admitted doesn't mean they're going to be offered a tuition exchange scholarship, just to clarify that. As I said, you know, it can be competitive, and we're going to talk about that in a moment. So how do you get started? And I'll just share an anecdote. I mentioned I have two children in college on tuition exchange. And when my children were going through the college search process, when I was at a university, you know, at that time, we really didn't have a way to kind of connect the dots between the member schools on the tuition exchange list and who offered their major and what size the school was and all that information. So it was kind of a little challenging because you had to kind of work off of a list and then kind of do your own research online. So I'm getting a little ahead of myself, but I'm going to show you some tools that are going to help make that part of the process easier. But the first thing you really want to do before your student even really begins their tuition exchange school search is find out what your school's policy is for tuition exchange to ensure that you or your student, whoever might be the applicant for tuition exchange, is going to be eligible. You know, just for example, some schools might have a minimum period that you have to be employed. They could have other criteria for eligibility. So find out what your school's policy is and then review what their process is. So what do I mean by that? Well, for some schools, they might have an internal form that you have to complete to let them know that you or your dependent is applying for tuition exchange. And once you know those two things, if you know you or your dependent are eligible and you know what you have to do to get considered for tuition exchange at your school, which is the export school, then the school search can begin. And when your student is going to apply for tuition exchange, they'll be able to list up to 20 schools on the tuition exchange application. We know, you know, as parents, when you're going through the college search process with your student, it can be a process, right? You know, you might be starting to do college visits, maybe they're investigating schools online. You're attending maybe other webinars as well. We know your time is busy with that as you're going through the college process with your student. But if there are schools that maybe they put on their application initially, and then as you go and they are going through the college search process, they're no longer interested in one of the schools, they can go and remove it from their application. They can also add an additional school to fill that spot, but they can't have more than 20 active schools on their tuition exchange application. And by the way, that 20 is not kind of a random number. That aligns with the number of schools on the common application. So how do you narrow the list? I'm going to hop into our tuition exchange public website. So if you haven't been to tuitionexchange.org, it's a good one to bookmark. But when you come out to our homepage, you're going to see as you scroll down, one of the first things is find your school. And if your student comes in here and maybe you're in here helping them get started, they can search just for tuition exchange colleges and universities. So let's say, for example, your student is interested in majoring in engineering. they can come in here and they can search on major. Or maybe they're interested in schools in San Diego. They can put in San Diego and search on San Diego. They can search on different criteria. And when they come in, the great thing is they now know 271 schools in the network that offer engineering at the undergraduate level. And if they maybe want to sort them by school name or one of the other factors here, they can click on school name, and here we are. And they can then learn some additional information about a particular school by clicking on it. And they'll see all of this great information about the campus, their admit rate, the size of the student body. You can see there's even videos for some of them, their admissions criteria and process, cost, what majors they offer, information about athletics, etc. But if you come over here and click this little button that says View TE Scholarship Details, this will take you to this TE scholarship profile for the school. And this information is maintained by the member school itself, not by TE Central. So this information, the TLOs enter into a system and they update it each year. But if you go to a specific school's TE scholarship profile, you'll be able to see information about how they award their tuition exchange scholarship. So for example, will they consider students other than freshmen? In this particular case, the school will. Will they offer tuition exchange to graduate students? In this case, the school will not. What's really important to note is what their deadline is for import applications. This means this is the date that your student would have to apply for tuition exchange by to be considered for TE at that institution. And you'd want to make sure that they've applied for admission by that date too. Now, spoiler alert, okay, what you're seeing right now in the system for most schools is going to reflect, well, not most, maybe about half. It might reflect, as it does in this case, their 25-26 information, because our new cycle is going to kick off for the 26-27 year on July 1st. That is when the new TE application will open. So the schools are in the process right now of updating and providing their 26-27 information. And you're going to start to see that information out there when your student goes to apply for tuition exchange, maybe on July 1st or soon thereafter. You'll also see on the TE scholarship profile information about how they award the scholarship. So do they require the FAFSA? In this case, the school does not require it. How about any federal or state grants or other scholarships that the student might receive from the college or university? Can they receive it on top of their tuition exchange scholarship as a stackable amount? Or will it be used as an offset to reduce the tuition exchange scholarship amount? So you'll find that information for each school on their TE scholarship profile. You'll also get a sense of how many they awarded in the prior year for tuition exchange. And if they have any information about eligible programs, that will be noted there as well. You're also going to see, if I take you back to our school search on the right, just to mention for you, for parents here who might be considering additional schooling for themselves, there is also a group of TE member schools that offer tuition exchange at the graduate level. Now, you'd have to check your export schools policy to see if they will certify tuition exchange eligibility at the graduate or doctoral level, and how is it available for employees to apply for or just for employees' dependents. So again, that's going to vary depending on the school, but you could search for graduate schools here as well. The other thing I wanted to show you, though, if you come down here, you're going to see that we have some featured schools. These are some schools who have said, hey, we would love to connect with your student. So if your student happens to click on one of our featured schools here, I'll just, I'll click on Florida Tech here and go in. Well, actually, maybe it's not going to show up for Florida Tech because I think I already raised my hand for them. But you'll see a little green button up here when I go to Hofstra that says, yes, connect me. And if your student clicks that and fills out a little registration information, that means that Hofstra will now have your student as a contact, and they can reach out to them and send your student more information. So I wanted to share that with you as well. If your student's interested in connecting with specific schools, they'll be able to do that for some of the schools in the platform that have asked to kind of get the hand raisers who are interested in their school. So keeping with our diving theme, you've started the search process. Your student is narrowing down their list. They've used that school search tool, and they're getting to the end of the diving board and getting ready to take the plunge. And we'll talk about the application process in a second. But a tip that that I wanted to share, and then I know we also heard from other TE parents of current tuition exchange recipients, is to kind of track everything. And I know one thing that helped me as my children were going through the process, each of whom applied to 20 colleges and universities. So it got a little tricky when there was a lot of schools in play. Is that I put everything in an Excel chart and kind of tracked, okay, for each school that they're applying for admission to and applying for tuition exchange to, what's the admissions deadline for this school? What's the tuition exchange application deadline for imports? That's what your student would be to that school, an import. Do they offer a full tuition TE scholarship, or is it the set rate amount or a totally different amount? Do they require the FAFSA or CSS profile form? And what's the email address of the tuition exchange liaison officer in case I have very specific questions? And this really helped me to kind of track and help them track as they applied for admission. I could help and guide them to make sure that the tuition exchange information and application deadlines were being met as well. So just a little helpful tip to ensure you can be organized and help your student be organized as they go through the process. As mentioned, though, the process can be competitive. So because your student applies for tuition exchange doesn't mean that they'll be guaranteed a tuition exchange scholarship. And one piece of advice that I know Kristen and I both would want to share, having been through the process, is that it's a great idea to set expectations with your student, but to not have them put all of their eggs in one basket. They have up to 20 slots on the TE application. And if they need or will, let's say, will be making a decision about what school they attend on the basis of whether they get a tuition exchange scholarship to their school, it's going to be important for you to encourage them to cast a wide net. If you list only one or two schools and those schools are very competitive for admission and are likely very competitive for tuition exchange as well, they might be disappointed if they don't get offered a tuition exchange scholarship there. So if tuition exchange is a critical component for your student in terms of selecting a college or university, then it is really important for them to diversify their last list and cast a wide net, so that they're not, again, kind of putting all their eggs in one basket and at the end being disappointed. I'll also mention NACAP, which is the National Association of College Admissions Counselors. They survey schools after May 1st, the national candidate reply date or deposit date each year, to ask if they still have spots available for admission. And they publicize that information. TE Central does the same thing. After May 1st, we survey TE member schools to say, hey, do you still have any tuition exchange scholarships available for the upcoming year? And you can actually see that list on our website right now. I know most of you are probably parents of rising high school seniors, so you're interested in the 26-27 academic year. Obviously, the list that's out there now is referring to students entering college this fall of 25. But we will also publicize that list in the event your student doesn't receive any tuition exchange scholarships and they get to May 1 and are interested to see who might still have spots available. So in terms of you've approached the springboard, you're diving in, what does your student have to do to apply? And the key there is your student. It isn't the parent that will be applying for tuition exchange, it will be the student. And the application process is pretty simple. It's 2 steps. So for the first step, the student, not the parent, will create a tuition exchange account, and they can do that through the link that's here or right on our website on the landing page at tuitionexchange.org. You'll see information they can click and apply through there. We really encourage them to make sure they use an email address that will remain with them after high school. Because if for some reason they decide to transfer and they fill out a transfer application for tuition exchange later, they're not going to want those emails going to their high school account, because many high schools will, cut that account off after they graduate. So make sure they use an email that will stay with them after high school and through college. And once they create their account, which will take about 60 seconds, they can then log right in and complete their TE application. But again, if they go to apply right now, they're only going to see the 2025-2026 application. And for a few more days, literally 6, the 24-25 school year application, which isn't going to do them any good. So if they're a rising high school senior or transfer seeking tuition exchange for fall of 2026 or spring of 2027, that application will open up on July 1st. So they don't want to go out and apply now. They can go ahead and create the account. That's fine, and have it ready. But until we hit 12:01 a.m. on July 1st, they won't be able to apply. So, all right, I'm going to turn it over to Kristen, and she is going to talk to you about some great tips that we've gotten from TE parents.
Thank you, Liz. And I have really enjoyed it. Being in the midst of this heat wave, I've enjoyed the diving analogy. It's making me feel cooler. I was tempted to change the headline on this one to avoid a belly flop, but back roll works just as well. This slide is too detailed to share with you. So I'm going to summarize some of the items, but just so you know, when you get a copy of the deck, you'll have access to every single one of these tips from current parents of tuition exchange students, which is terrific. None of these will probably surprise those of you who have been through the college search before with another student, because many of the things that you learned going through the college admissions process also pertain to the tuition exchange scholarship search. You cannot underestimate how long and how many options there are out there. Liz gave you just a quick glimpse of that search platform with hundreds of schools. It's so much to your benefit if you can start researching schools early on and keep an open mind. So look at schools that you may never have heard of before. As you saw in that search feature, you can identify schools that might offer a particular major or be in a certain geographic area. And as Liz showed you the example of the chart, anything you can do to stay organized, because it can be overwhelming, not just tracking all of the tuition exchange scholarship information, but the fine details about the financial aid policies. I'm ready for the next couple of bullets, Liz. Bear in mind that just as your college counselor for students would recommend a range of institutions from a selectivity standpoint, we advise the very same approach for students interested in a tuition exchange scholarship. Someone had asked if the schools will publish the number of applications that they've received in the prior year. We actually have access to that information. We can track the number of applications for a tuition exchange scholarship that a school receives. So we will be in this coming cycle for the very first time providing families with that information so that you can look and see how many applications a particular school may have received for a scholarship. And that will help inform your list because, again, as Liz said, you have up to 20 shots on goal, if you will, and you want to take advantage of all of those opportunities. Our goal for you as parents and as professionals is for you to end up with a scholarship at the end of the process on behalf of your student. So, the more schools that you consider, the more likely it is that your student will receive a scholarship. You do want to think outside the box a little bit. So sometimes when a student is crafting their list of criteria, they have a very narrow vision of what schools may be desirable. I encourage you as parents to help your student think a little more broadly about their options and to, again, keep an open mind. You do want to pay close attention to deadlines. That goes without saying. There's nothing worse than finding the perfect school and then realizing, oh, it's past their deadline, so we're ineligible to submit that application. Side note about deadlines, that May 1 space available list that Liz referred to. Side note, somebody was asking where that's posted. That is on the Tuition Exchange website. It's part of the drop-down menu under the application subheading, so you can find it there. The schools that we include in that space available list after May 1, they have agreed that they will still accept both admissions applications as well as tuition exchange scholarship applications. Um, we recommend in general, and the parents we surveyed recommend that you file the FAFSA. Nobody enjoys filing the FAFSA, but it is a necessary evil and something that can potentially provide options as you go through the process. As Liz noted, the scholarships are not guaranteed. It's entirely possible that the school that your son or daughter is excited about requires submission of the FAFSA. So to hedge your bets, we strongly recommend you submit the FAFSA as part of the process. As also, as Liz noted earlier, the tuition exchange scholarship is among the most generous scholarships out there, and yet the cost of room and board, lab supplies, art supplies, books, whatever the case may be, travel, adds up. So do budget for those ancillary expenses. Take advantage of the TLOs. One of you asked, can we contact the TLOs? Yes, you can. And on the one page that Liz was showing you, when you click that green button, thank you, Liz, for the demo. When you click the information about the scholarship profile, you will see the liaison officer's information on that page. So just bear in mind, you are fully entitled to contact the person. You probably know this instinctively, but I'll say it just in case. There is one or sometimes two individuals charged with serving as a point of contact, and there could be literally hundreds of students applying. So if you do reach out to the TLO, be patient and recognize that they're juggling a job that entails more than just supporting students through the tuition exchange scholarship process. And then the last one, come up with a plan B. Think through what options may be available and talk your student through that process as well. So they can be mindful of the fact that if their first or second choice doesn't pan out, there are other options available to them. In general, we encourage you to check the tuition exchange account on a regular basis. You will not, and your student will not receive email notifications through your inbox. You're going to need to go to the account to see what's happening, or your student, in actuality, will be going to look and see if there's a notification update. As Liz said in the very beginning of this presentation, every school has a slightly different process for selecting students as recipients, and also their timeline and notification process can vary. So be mindful of the fact that there's no one date by which you would necessarily hear good news about the scholarship. You'll of course want to review the offers and look at the fine print. You're going to pick a school and send in your enrollment deposit. And then we ask that you notify any of the other schools that may have extended a tuition exchange scholarship offer to you that you're not coming. Because in many cases, they have a long list and it's rank ordered, and that will allow the next student on the list to get good news. Special situations. If you are the parent of a student who decides to transfer, they've received the scholarship, they've enrolled at a tuition exchange school, and they're thinking about transferring to another institution, there is a mechanism to take that tuition exchange, use the tuition exchange scholarship process to pursue another institution. It's a separate application, and whether or not the student gets it at the next institution depends on the decision by that new institution. But there is certainly a process in place in case your student changes their minds. Leave of absence, that can vary by school. If the leave of absence extends beyond 9 months, I can assure you a new application will be required. But for those who have not yet viewed the application, it is minimal. It's a 10 to 15-minute process, very straightforward. If you as the parent leave your position at the institution where you are and have been certified, then what happens is that institution will probably no longer certify your student for the scholarship in the following semester. It is unusual for that to be an immediate termination. Typically, the scholarship would continue through the end of whatever term it is where you might cease to be an employee. It can vary school to school, so do check with the institution. Summer school, typically the awards are for fall and spring, or if it's a trimester, the equivalent of that fall, winter, spring calendar. It typically does not include the summer term, but you are welcome to check with the individual schools, and sometimes calendars vary from school to school. And similarly, the 5-year program, if you were pursuing a degree in architecture, for example, and there are others that come to mind that may well go 5 years, it's possible the institution will extend the tuition exchange award through a 5th year. Typically, however, it's a 4-year or 8-semester award. So this is what we would recommend you think about in terms of the timeline. July, which is just a week away, is really when things kick off. It's the perfect time to check with your employer school and make sure you understand whatever process they have in place for certifying eligibility. And then certainly start the process by having your student create an account and then fill out that easy application. As Liz said, you could do the admissions application first if you want, or if you wish to start with the TE Easy application, that's fine too. September through May, you're going to, again, want to check the account. Make sure you're getting whatever notifications have been posted. You can add or remove schools as you go. So those 20 slots are actually flexible in the sense that if, as you or your student is going through the process and they've decided against schools at a distance or schools with a particular academic program, they can add or remove as they see fit. Again, look at the fine print And then be sure at the end of the process to notify the school where you have decided to enroll that you'd like to take them up on the scholarship. In future years, good news, nothing more is needed unless, as a parent, you're separating from your home institution, or unless your student wishes to try for a tuition exchange scholarship at another school if they're thinking about transferring. If it's a steady state scenario, there's nothing more you need to do on the tuition exchange side. However, your export institution, your employer institution may ask you to fill out a form on an annual basis just to confirm your enrollment or your student's enrollment. Here is a roster of some of the questions that regularly come up, and some of you have already tossed out a few of those questions. Um, if you want to go ahead to the next slide, Liz, these are all factors that you may want to weigh in on as you consider your potential schools. Just a few of the common Q&A issues that bubble up on a regular basis. Sometimes people ask us, is there a minimum number of scholarships that schools have to offer? Yes, three per year. So the minimum number would be 12 over the course of a 4-year degree program. Do schools need to maintain a balance? We ask schools to do their very best in terms of maintaining a balance. And we also recognize that number can fluctuate from year to year. They have sometimes limited control over what 17-year-olds decide in terms of enrollment decisions. Early decision, is that going to increase or decrease my chances of winning a tuition exchange award? That really can vary by school. I would encourage you to ask the admissions office or the financial aid office at any of the schools that you're thinking about for an early decision, which is a binding agreement. Can more than one student in your family receive a tuition exchange scholarship at the same time? The answer is yes, potentially. It depends on the guidelines for your home institution. So check with the export TILO, check any information on the website. But we have instances where families have multiple students receiving tuition exchange scholarships. Yes. Fees, again, that can vary from school to school, and it's a way for participating institutions to defray some of the expenses to keep this benefit program going. And is tuition exchange taxable? We would encourage you to check with your accountant. Generally speaking, tuition is not taxable, but again, that can vary, and we do not want to mislead you in terms of tax advice. Merit scholarships. Will schools offer merit in addition to tuition exchange? Sometimes it's possible. Sometimes schools will also provide housing awards or room tour funding towards room and board. In truth, though, more often than not, schools will say, oh, the tuition exchange award is more generous than our best merit award, so we're going to have you receive the tuition exchange award in lieu of the merit award that you originally received. Sometimes you can receive federal, state, or outside grants and scholarships in addition. Again, that is on the same page that Liz showed you earlier, where you see the detailed scholarship information. So all of that information is publicly available and posted at the beginning of the application cycle. We already touched on this question about employment. Check with the export TILO. You're not going to get an email notification. You're going to need to log into that account to check on the status. Is there a date by which you or your student will need to accept a tuition exchange scholarship? For an enrollment deadline, May 1 is still typically the candidate reply date. The individual schools, however, may ask that they get a decision on the scholarship at a different point in time. So you will need to check with each individual school to find out what their expectation is. And again, there are other students waiting in the wings. So the sooner, the better in terms of notifying them if you're not planning to take advantage of a scholarship offer. If my student isn't awarded the scholarship in the first year, can they be considered for future years? One of you had typed in a question along these lines because you know now that your student won't be eligible until a year into their college experience. You certainly can apply as a upper class student. You can certainly apply in future years if you don't receive it as a first year student. But you want to check with the school of choice, the place where your student enrolls to find out if that's likely to happen. And then how do you hear if the scholarship is coming your way? That should be in the portal, but the timeline can vary pretty significantly from institution to institution. So the import school TLOs are your best resource on that score. And then we talked about where to go to get information after May 1. Next slide. This is now your chance to ask questions. I will say somebody had asked if we could repeat the out of state 50% award guidelines. That's for public institutions. So if your student is considering a public school within the tuition exchange network, those schools are required to offer for out-of-state students 50% of the out-of-state tuition cost. And I'll just jump in with two other questions that I saw in advance. The Paychex exchange, somebody asked, oh, so does that mean if we're part of the tuition exchange network, we can't also participate or apply to the Paychex schools? It just so happens that all of the Paychex schools, except one, are also tuition exchange schools. So the good news there is you are going to be able to apply to virtually all of the Paychex schools, not as a Paychex candidate, but as a tuition exchange candidate, which is nice.
Thanks, Kristen. I'll give you a break there from all that great information that you shared. One parent shared a comment that I just wanted to share with the group. It's a good tip that they found out that some of the TE schools that their student, I guess they have another or a dependent perhaps in the program currently, that the TE application deadline was earlier than the admissions deadline for the school. So just keep that in mind, and thank you for sharing that. We had several questions around knowing how competitive a scholarship might be at a given school. You know, what's the size of the pool? So currently on that scholarship profile that I showed you for the institutions, you will be able to see how many scholarships they offered for the 24-25 year, as well as how many students that they offered enrolled. What you won't be able to see yet, but you'll be able to see it next March, only because we went through a system data conversion this past year. So we couldn't put this data point out there since it wasn't fully accurate due to our data conversion last summer. But next March, March 1, there will be data out there for the 25-26 year for schools that will show the total number of applications they received for the 25-26 academic year, as well as how many scholarships they offered for 25-26 and how many enrolled. So if you, I realize that if you have a high school, rising high school senior, you're like, well, I probably need to know before then. That's a question that you can ask the TLO. You can, if your student narrows their list, you can reach out to the TLO to get a sense of what their typical application pool is in a given year. And then if they know how many they plan to award for the 26-27 year. We have another question. If a student applies to 20 schools and they don't get a scholarship, can they still apply after May 1st for other schools that have availability? Yes, as we mentioned, we will publicize that TE post May 1 scholarships available list on our website. And we do tell the schools, don't add yourself to that list if you're also not accepting students for admission at this point, right? Because you can't get a TE scholarship unless your student's accepted for admission. But in the case where your student used all 20 slots on their application and they decide to apply to a school for TE after May 1st, keep in mind they're going to have to remove, they can't have more than 20 active schools on the application at one point. So they're going to have to remove at least one school if they're going to add another school on there.
I'll jump in with one quick item, which I thought was good, and I hadn't thought about this, and this is the first time seeing it. The question was, what happens to the application? Is this an application that is going directly to the schools? Is this an application that gets completed on the tuition exchange site? It works just like the common application. In other words, you're going to go to the tuition exchange site, well, your student will, and complete the application form, put in the number of schools, the names of the schools where they want that scholarship application to go, and then it goes to those institutions. So it's not as if the student then has to negotiate getting that scholarship application to the individual schools. It's a centralized process.
Thanks, Kristen. And one thing I'll also mention, another question that came in, do the schools that you list on your application, do they see the other schools your student has applied for tuition exchange to? And the answer is no. So the import schools can't see where your student applied for admission. However, your export school TLO, they'll be able to see all the schools that your student listed on their application. Another question that came in, and actually a couple different folks kind of asked this in a different way, but if your student is a high school junior right now, they won't be able to complete the application yet. The TE Easy application that will be launching July 1st is for the 2026-2027 academic year. So fall of 26, spring of 2027. If your student is applying for tuition exchange, they don't need to know they don't first off have to list 20 schools, but they don't need to know all 20 schools anyway at once when they first initially apply. They might apply for tuition exchange and maybe there's 5 or 6 schools on their list at that point, but then when they go through the college search process in the fall, visit schools, go to open houses and such, they might add more schools, but again, they don't have to know all 20 right out of the gate. When they initially apply, they can add and remove schools as they go through the process. Another question that we had in relation to FAE checks that came up, if you're, and just to kind of revisit a couple other questions that came in that I answered directly to the folks that asked them. Again, with FAE checks, that's the Catholic Jesuit School Exchange. Your student can't be considered for a FAE check scholarship unless you are employed at a FAE check school. However, let's say you are an employee at a FAE check school. When your student applies for tuition exchange, they still can list 20 different schools. And let's say they apply to a school that is a FAE check school. When they submit the application and they apply to that school, let's just say Marquette University. When they list Marquette University on their TE Easy application, they're getting consideration for both TE and FAE checks at Marquette. Marquette will decide whether they get TE or FAE checks, but that constitutes one slot on their TE Easy application. So they're using one of their 20 slots. I hope that's clear.
I'm going to jump in. A couple people have asked about the sequence, like what is the order of operations? All right, you can do whatever you want. My recommendation as a parent is as follows. It's easy, as the name suggests, to do the TE Easy application. So there's really no downside to completing the TE Easy application other than you need to remember to go back in and add or subtract schools as the college search proceeds. But in terms of order, I strongly recommend exactly what Sarah is suggesting in the Q&A. One, create the account. Two, you could apply to the uh, you're not applying to the home university. You're applying to the schools where your student wishes to attend. But along the way, complete the TE Easy application, then tackle the more challenging task, which is the admissions applications to the various schools. And then you just hope for the best, and try to forget about the process and know that you've done your utmost in terms of getting an early start, being organized, doing research, thinking about a wide range of institutions at a wide range of selectivity levels. And then somebody else asked, okay, what if they submit the applications at the same time, the TE Easy application and the admissions application? Where are they going to hear from? Which of those are they going to hear about first? I can promise you, you're going to hear about the offer of admission first, because if your student is not admitted, they're not going to get an award. And pro tip, every single year, believe it or not, we have students who are denied tuition exchange scholarships because they neglected to submit an admissions application. So that may seem silly, and yet it happens every year.
Thanks, Kristen. Um, Another question that we've gotten kind of relation to timeline is um, kind of implying there's a lag. I'm applying, my student's applying for admission and tuition exchange in the fall. Like, how long is it going to take before we hear? And again, just to reiterate that, it does depend on the school. So the schools have their own timeline. You can get an inkling by looking at what their import application deadline is. But that doesn't mean they're immediately, once their deadline has passed, that they're immediately going to start making offers. And it can also be a rolling process. So it is not uncommon at schools for this process to go on through the end of April, and even as evidenced by the fact that we have schools that still have spots available after May 1st. So if you want to get a sense of the awarding timeline for a specific school, my advice would be to check with the TLO and ask when they begin to make offers and when they generally complete making offers for the cycle. A question we had in relation to renewal. So if we have a student, the question is, if the student's awarded TE at the point that they apply for admission, is it possible they might not get it their second year and beyond, assuming that the parent, stays with the same employer? For the majority of institutions that are offering tuition exchange at the undergraduate level to an incoming freshman, they're offering the scholarship for 8 semesters or 4 years. Now, some schools will attach certain criteria for renewal, just as they would with any merit scholarship. So they might say the student has to maintain a certain GPA. There are even some schools that might say student has to live in university housing to get tuition exchange. So in general, if your student's meeting the criteria that's outlined in their scholarship offer letter, it should be renewed if they're, meeting the criteria that were listed there. But that's why it's important, as Kristen said, to read the fine print. Another question about order. Does it matter what order I'm listing the schools on the application? It does not. And another question in relation to order, does it matter in terms of, do I create the TE account first, apply for tuition exchange first? Again, I think Kristen just touched on that. So You can do it simultaneously. There is not a specific order that you have to follow. But again, your student's generally not going to get offered a TE scholarship if they're not accepted for admission. We talked about the timeline for awards.
Liz, there was a question about the QR code going to an earlier version of this very same presentation. We did a football version in the fall. We're trying to get creative with the information.
Go back. That is odd because it wasn't that way this afternoon. So,
The information, you won't see the fun diving subheads, but the information is largely identical.
well, and there's a link on this slide. Let me bring it back up for you to the QR code. So, or to the presentation. So, sorry, mouse is a little bit sensitive. If you want to copy that link, it's going to take you there, but that is quite odd because it was actually okay earlier. Okay, let's keep with our questions. If a student is looking to play a sport and is using an NCSA account to get noticed by potential colleges, will the import school be favorable to sports students? So it's up to the import school who they award tuition exchange scholarships to. If your student is an athlete, I might ask the TLO up front whether they will stack athletic scholarships with a tuition exchange award. If a student, okay, I think we already got that one. Let's see. If a student is
So
not,
I'll just piggyback on that. The question had come up from a couple of people about criteria used by schools. Just like the admissions process, it can vary pretty dramatically from school to school. So it could be that they have a new academic program and they're looking for students who are interested in that particular major. It could be that they're hoping to grow the geographic diversity and that will play into the process. I will tell you the preponderance of decisions for admissions and for scholarships are based on really basic criteria, such as the rigor of the student's course program, so how challenging their academic record is, the nature of their course load, and the grades that they get in those classes. So more often than not, that is the case. Somebody also had asked just a point of clarification when I said students may be denied tuition exchange scholarships because they never applied for admission. So that's just the point of clarification. There are actually instances every single year where a student will neglect to submit their admissions application. So there's two separate things going on. As that diagram earlier in the deck shows, a student is applying for admission at a school as a degree candidate, and then separately, they're applying for a tuition exchange scholarship.
there's a couple questions about a student and their citizenship eligibility for tuition exchange. So it is up to the import school, again, who they consider for tuition exchange. So you could pose that question to the TLO to ask, will you consider an international student for tuition exchange? I have just also posted in the chat the link to the presentation. So someone mentioned they were having difficulty copying the link. I see folks in there now, so hopefully you're able to get to that without issue. All right, let's go back here. So
Liz, there's a question about renewing a FAYCHEX award. The good news, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that the FAYCHEX program is supported by tuition exchange. So the answer is no, that unless the school has specific guidelines that require you to fill out a form on an annual basis, from our standpoint, there's nothing more that the student needs to do from year to year.
okay, a couple of requests for the link. Again, the link is in the chat. In terms of the recording of the webinar, it will be posted to tuitionexchange.org to the family webinar page, but after July 16th. So the recording does not get automatically emailed out to everyone that attended. Great. Thank you for saying you can access the presentation. If a university lists their scholarship amount as other tuition amount, what does that mean? So as I mentioned, schools have the option to offer a full tuition scholarship or a scholarship in the amount of the TE set rate, or a scholarship amount that's somewhere between those. So I'll just give an example. Say an institution is $60,000 for tuition for the upcoming academic year. They could choose to offer the TE set rate amount for the upcoming year, which is $43,000, or they could choose to offer a full tuition scholarship, which would be $60,000, or maybe they want to do something in between that. So maybe they offer a TE scholarship that's $50,000. So it is up to them, but the minimum would be the TE set rate amount, with the exception of out-of-state students at public schools, which we already talked a bit about. Okay. Another question about the data that you're seeing on the school scholarship profile. If it says that the school had enrolled 12 students, does that mean in May the school had 8 remaining to give? So what that basically means on the TE scholarship profile, you'll see a number that says how many TE scholarships did they offer and how many enrolled at that school. You can't necessarily assume that the difference between those two numbers is the number of scholarships they have available. A school might have budgeted to enroll 10 students on tuition exchange scholarships, but because they're going to obviously get some declines from students that they offer to, they're going to wind up offering more than they actually really want to enroll and that they've budgeted for. So I hope that makes sense.
Somebody asked, when's the soonest you can start the process if your student is a sophomore? I strongly encourage you to begin the shopping phase of this process right away, because researching schools is time consuming. Even just getting the word of mouth information about schools can take quite a while and be very fruitful. The actual application, you can't submit your TE Easy application until the summer prior to the senior year in high school, if it's for an undergraduate degree.
Another question that came in: if I leave the university but my spouse still works there, does the tuition exchange automatically shift over to them? You would want to check with your TLO in that case. They can actually edit on your student's application the parent employee information, but of course that there is the underlying assumption that the parent that it shifts to does meet the TE eligibility requirements for your school. Another question kind of is asking, does it matter the date by which you apply? In other words, is it kind of first come, first serve? Or there's some schools who award based on that? Like many things in life, our advice would be, the early bird can get the worm. It can be true of tuition exchange, but it does depend on the school. Some schools may make awards early to students that have applied for tuition exchange and been admitted early. Others may wait until they get their full TE application pool and then make decisions to rank students. So it really does depend on the institution. But our advice, as Kristen said, is, apply early, both for admission and for tuition exchange, and make sure you know what the deadlines for each of those processes are at the schools your student is interested in.
Michael, you asked a great question, and 2 very good tries, and you're close, but not quite. So the answer for the public schools is the award needs to be 50% of the out-of-state tuition. I hope that helps.
All right, and I think our last question here, if a student's not offered a TE scholarship right away, do they stay on a wait list for the school in case someone declines? It depends on the school. So schools,
Ask, ask,
it,
they
it,
may.
it's worth asking. But some schools, the process really varies. So check with the TLO and let them know that your student is waiting in the wings. And, particularly if they plan to enroll, so that they are aware and know that there is interest should a spot open up. All right, Kristen, I think we have done it. Thank you all so much for taking time out of your schedule. We really appreciate it. Oh, thank you, James. We appreciate that. Just a reminder that we do have another webinar July 16th. It will be the same topic, but if you want to hear it again, and we will after that date post a recording to the website of one of the webinars. So thank you, thank you. We wish you and your students best of luck.
Yes, you're going to do great. The fact that you're taking the time to do this in the summer is a good sign. You're going to be in great shape.
That's right. Thank you all. Have a great evening.